So if you were in the room for the last session, or if you're watching online and you were in this stage, we were discussing Scope 3 at length. And that's something we're going to talk about now in this panel discussion as well. Joining us, as you can see from the graphics, we have Mark Jones, Chief Sustainability Officer at THG. We have Javier Lopez Gomez, Global Head of Corporate Sustainability at SGS, and Paddy Linnigan, Chief Sustainability Officer at Clyde & Co. Please welcome our panels. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to try and cover Scope 3, or as much of it as we can, in about half an hour, 40 minutes. A lot to go at. So, Paddy, starting with you actually, how do you actually define Scope 3 emissions, and why is it crucial for organisations to address them in their sustainability strategies?
Okay, thanks, Scott. Scope 3 emissions for us encompass all the indirect greenhouse gas emissions that are outside of our control. And so for Clyde & Co, the three main categories that we have to wrestle with are business travel, employee commuting and home working, purchase goods and services in relation to our overheads, but perhaps slightly different to some of the people who purchase goods and services on behalf of our clients. So those will be the disbursements we incur on matters such as barristers' fees, etc. Why is it crucial to address the challenge in our supply chain? It was interesting listening to some of the percentages and factoration that we heard this morning. I think if you look at the companies who disclosed through CDP last year, Scope 3 represents sort of 11 times the value of Scope 1 and Scope 2 in their emissions. For us, it's approaching 20 times Scope 1, Scope 2. Scope 1, Scope 2 is a really, really small proportion of our greenhouse gas emissions. So about 96% of our Scope 3, 96% of our emissions is Scope 3, and that's roughly split a third across those three categories. And what that really points out is focusing on Scope 1 and Scope 2 is insufficient for an organisation like ourselves. But if we can measure and manage our Scope 3 emissions, we can gain insights into our emissions hotspots, we can prioritise reduction strategies, we can evaluate supplier sustainability performance, inform decision-making and procurement, akin to the last fireside chat, but perhaps more importantly, encourage innovation for more sustainable products.
And Javier, same question to you actually. How are you defining Scope 3 emissions? And just give us an overview of the impact it has on your organisation.
Yeah, sure. So for those who don't know, well, I'm the Global Head of Corporate Sustainability at SGS. For those who don't know, SGS is a certification inspection company with close to 100,000 employees across more than 100 countries. So we're a service company. That means that in our case, we don't sell products. Our force is our people. That means that when we look at the company with the Scope 3 glasses, it's quite similar situation with what Paddy described. Is 90% of our emissions come from Scope 3. And even more important, when we look at categories 3.1, 3.2, I mean, supply chain is 80% of our Scope 3. So for us, it's definitely when we want to, if we want to make a contribution to have an actual impact in our carbon footprint, we need to look at the Scope 3, obviously. But it's not just us as a service company. I think it's all the sectors. As Paddy says, if you look at the CDP, the average is 75%, regardless the sector, are Scope 3. There are some sectors that can be an exception, such as, well, the energy-intensive sectors, such as steel or cement. But in average, if you think in any sector, agri-food, life, pharma, real estate, etc., I am sure that they are higher than 70%, the 75%, which is the average, right? So, I mean, we've seen during all the sessions. Better? Oh, much better. Okay, so we've seen during all the session that, and I count the times that I count the word supply chain or Scope 3 because it's always on the top 2 or top 3 priorities for every company. Regulation is always in there, but quickly, secondly, comes Scope 3.
Okay, Mark, same to you actually. Just give us an idea of your Scope 3.
Sure. Hopefully this is working. So for those that don't know, THG is a global e-commerce group kind of based in Manchester. So we have our nutrition and kind of beauty divisions kind of powered by our Ingenuity e-commerce group. So we own some of the largest groups such as MyProtein, Look Fantastic, Cult Beauty as examples. So our supply chain is very diverse, everything from agriculture to kind of the traditional retailers. And so for us, our Scope 3 is about 97% of our total carbon footprint, and specifically Category 1s and Category 4s. So in total, those two categories account for about 80% of that 97% footprint. So for us, we've kind of been looking at tackling at all of our purchased goods suppliers across beauty and nutrition, and then also tackling for our transport and distribution.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Javier, back to you. Now, as supply chains become increasingly complex, what are the biggest challenges and opportunities that you've encountered driving sustainability initiatives related to Scope 3 reduction?
Mm-hmm. Some challenges, couple of them probably. Well, first of all, probably because of the nature of the Scope 3, I mean, we have a lot of categories, upstream, downstream, with very different, diverse in nature. So that complexity, scalability, and data availability is definitely one of the challenge, because we are talking about from waste, from employee commuting to the supply chain, what we were thinking, or to the end customer use if we look at downstream, right? So that complexity is definitely one of the challenges that can be higher or lower depending on the company you are looking at. Then a second challenge, it's obviously the limited control. It was raised by the previous speaker. I mean, Scope 3 lies outside direct control. It depends on your clients. It depends on your suppliers at the time. It depends also on the final end users of the products of the company. So that is definitely another challenge that the companies need to figure out how to get further control on that. Then, that said, looking at the positive side and the opportunities that lies ahead, one thing, and I think is the key thing to highlight in here, is it's an opportunity to engage with the stakeholders, to further collaborate. I mean, there is no single company in the world that can address the Scope 3. The Scope 3, by default, by definition, needs to be tackled in a collaborative way, which leads to collective action. So it's perfect for instance, in our case, talking or setting conversations with key suppliers around the Scope 3. That led us to starting from an open discussion, just sitting down to understand what are the issues we do have, what problems we want to solve. It led us actually to finish talking about or having conversations much beyond just about the Scope 3. It was more about digitalization, about innovation, etc. So that it's definitely an opportunity. Probably another opportunity that I would highlight when talking about the Scope 3 is the opportunity to optimize, to work on the optimization of the supply chain, especially working as well, as I was saying, with the lenses of the innovation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Paddy, while we're on this topic of collaboration and partnerships, which are, as Javier said, it's fundamental to Scope 3 anyway. What role do they play in driving supply chain sustainability and effectively addressing Scope 3? So we know it's essential. We know it's important to have this collaboration and partnerships. How do you leverage them? How do you make those partnerships work to tackle Scope 3?
Probably put in context for those who don't know Clyde & Co. They're a global law firm. We operate on 6 continents out of 70 offices, and we predominantly provide corporate services to large internationals. So in relation to the collaboration point, it's probably better description if I come out from the point of view, we are part of their supply chain. And we have a client who's happy to be name checked, QBE, who created a sustainability legal panel. And so we are one of 8 law firms on their panel, and together we are investigating ways where the 9 organizations together can amplify the effect and amplify what we do in relation to the sustainability agenda. And what we've been able to do, almost at an individual level, is we've been able to introduce a green energy scheme that we apply to all of our colleagues. When we start looking at working our own supply chain, we've partnered with an organization called Heart of the City, who provide a sponsorship program particularly for SMEs in relation to how do they start their journeys, how do they understand their impact, And where we've come at it, because we'll have a lot of common SMEs, so we have a common approach to those, so we're not asking them a myriad of questions, law firm A, law firm B, asking the different from the same supplier. So we're looking for a commonality of approach there, but also those that perhaps haven't thought about it, as we're sponsoring them to use the Heart of the City programme so that they start their journey, because it's in our interest. Because we are part of the client supply chain, and the more we can reduce our emissions, the more we can get our supply chain to reduce our emissions, the better we've improved with our clients. So one of the opportunities, just picking up on something Javier says, differentiation. That, getting ahead of the curve, knowing that you are going to be asked to reduce your emissions, even if you haven't been asked yet, is getting on that road now and moving that journey on. So getting that collaboration, that amplification of effect. And the last thing we're just looking at now is whether that group of 9 can put their resources together to meaningfully create some form of carbon offset projects or portfolio projects together, again, on the basis that as individual firms, we'll have a limited effect. Perhaps there's 9 firms pulling their resources, we can have a much more amplified effect quicker.
Yeah, if I can add, because it was very interesting what he said, which relates to the point which is the market transformation through the collaborations. I mean, if we look at the sectorial alliances that exist across the emissions, I think they are getting in a point that by working together, they are pushing and helping at the same time their supply chains, their providers, to create more, I mean, to reflect about their product portfolio, about the services portfolio, looking for more or less carbon products. Yeah.
Okay, look, let's talk about some success stories. Mark, can you give us some examples of how you've used initiatives or strategies within your own organisation to measure, even track, and reduce Scope 3? So share some of your successes.
Sure. So at THG, our sustainability journey is still in its early stages. So we launched our strategy kind of at the end of 2021. So we're kind of coming up to about 2 and a bit years old. We recently had our SBTi kind of targets approved back in September. And so from that point of September to kind of year to date, what we've done is we actually looked at the data that we got from our inventory. We then categorized, so based on our purchased goods and transport and distribution, we looked at the kind of the top spend. So we took a kind of a cutoff of about 50+% of our top spend. And then we created a new program called PACT, or Partnership in Action in short. So that was launched at the end of December. And really, the program tackles 3 things. The first one is to set very clear supply targets, because I think it's one thing to collect the data, but if your suppliers don't have anything tangible or context to why they're submitting the data except for reporting requirements, it doesn't really have a lot of kind of teeth to why they're doing it. So that was the first part, was creating these supply targets, and really the success for that was integrating into our supply chain standards, integrating it into kind of target approval by our board, and also linking it back into remuneration targets as well. So we were doing quite a lot of stuff just in that period of time just to get those targets really add some teeth. The second part of PACT was really kind of simplifying data collection. So for us, we could have easily looked at getting a software to collect the information, but really we wanted to really understand what that process would look like. So we've had to go very scrappy, created an Excel tools for the time being, but it looks at kind of creating information and collecting that data in the most simple way. And I think for us, one of the key challenges right now is, I think, getting in this motion of perfect data. I think we have to kind of refocus on progress over perfection, because I think that really slows you down in terms of the efforts that you really want to do with your suppliers. So we've tried to kind of simplify and kind of give different options for suppliers to give us data, whether it's CDP or corporate data allocated to spend, or if they have kind of LCAs, we'll accept those information. And then lastly for PACT is kind of creating resources. So for us, and probably the same for you guys, suppliers have different maturity in sustainability. So some are going to be really advanced. So the ones that we work with, so for example, like the L'Oreals and the Estés of the world, they have a lot of reports available and programs in place. And then when we're working with some of the farmers on the nutrition side, very different. But actually, there's data available. It's just how do you streamline and simplify that data collection. So for us, that's kind of how we've implemented it. And so we've been running it for about 3 months, and we've seen some really good successes. So we've had some kind of suppliers already reporting their Scope 1, Scope 2, and their Scope 3 emissions. For those suppliers that don't have that data, then we've provided resources through training materials, sharing best practice guidances, and really have that transparency across the group. I think it's a really important aspect of partnership, and through partnership, you do have to create that trust. So if you're asking for information from your suppliers, you do need to kind of give them something as a carrot in that end. So that's kind of how we've kind of implemented or started the implementation of Scope 3 for us.
It's interesting talking about perfect data, and I'll come back to that in a second. So I interviewed a anonymous procurement leader, shall we say, a couple of years ago, and he had a very large company and had about 10,000 suppliers, and we were talking about how geared up they were towards data and reporting. He said a lot of them didn't even have email, which surprised me. But it's a fact. You know, if you've got that number of suppliers, they're going to be at very different stages of their digital journey. So if perfect data you've decided is not always obtainable, what's good enough data for you? If you're not looking for perfect, what's good enough?
Yeah, so we've kind of taken it at different angles. So for those suppliers that have kind of the data available, like our beauty suppliers predominantly, we've kind of said, give us your reports, and then let's start off with allocated spend. Now, it's not the perfect science, but it's a start for the majority of our suppliers in terms of creating that engagement. For suppliers that also have quite a lot of information available, such as LCAs, what we're doing is kind of re-engineering that information and then back into our products, and then looking at feeding that into our inventory as such. For suppliers that are on the other end of the spectrum, we're having to do a little bit more hand-holding approach. So really what we're doing is a little bit more of a tailored approach with our suppliers. So for suppliers that don't even have Scope 1 and Scope 2, we've kind of just said to them, look at your utility information, identify what that looks like, and then let's work together on what information you can give to us, and then let's keep an open communication between our two groups. And really it's a very, we've not had to do kind of a blanket approach. I think for most people that you do for Scope 3, we've had to create a very kind of specific approach for certain aspects. Otherwise, for some of our largest nutrition suppliers who are so early on in their journey, especially the folks that are based in America, they need a lot more support in that sense. So you have to really understand your supply chain, understand your suppliers, and I think if you keep pushing them and you're not really listening to them, it does create a lot of fraction, and especially when there's commercial aspects within that, you do have to take into account all the different kind of factors into those relationships.
Yeah. Javier, how can we encourage suppliers to be more sustainable and to be more open with their data and reporting?
That's a very good question.
Yeah, if anyone
Well,
knows the
I
answer,
think-
we all want to know.
No, I generally say that there are two approaches that probably they are complementary. I mean, there is a more authoritarian approach, if you want, which, I mean, for instance, we do have a code of conduct for our suppliers, which is mandatory for all the suppliers that want to work with SGS, right? It's quite extended and common practice. It's considered, right, not even best practice, probably common practice. We do have as well self-assessment questionnaire, which, I mean, the code of conduct, it's obviously more to verify compliance. The self-assessment is more to identify the level of risk of the different suppliers and to have appropriate mitigation plans, right? And that is something that obviously we want to need it. We want to do it because it's part of our governance in the supply chain, I mean, management. But where the real value is, to me, is when we set collaboration with them. I mean, when we ask ourselves, how can I help my suppliers to be more sustainable, right? To decrease their Scope 1 and 2. And in there is where I think we have the opportunity. I mean, I think I'm lucky because I'm in a company that is delivering services as well, so we can help our clients as well, right, on the GSG accounting of their Scope 1 and 2, which at the end, it's going to be reflected in my Scope 3. So actually we've done so with some of the suppliers. So I think on that area, on training them, helping them to building capabilities, to understand sustainability requirements, and sharing with them best practices and how to implement is where the real value with the discussions are.
Paddy, when you're actually assessing the sustainability credentials of your suppliers, which criteria are more important, or which ones do you prioritise?
Well, just picking up on something that Javier just said, we've had in place for some time a code of conduct that we've had all of our supply chain in. But I think from our approach, there is an element of authoritarianism and there is an element of collaboration. The reason I say from an authoritarian perspective is we're experiencing that. Part of our challenge, well, it's no longer so much of a challenge, is I think we probably all have the same debate, is whether it's a moral imperative or a business imperative to get the board on board with that, particularly when you're talking about sort of a 30-year nebulous net zero target. One of our major customers, clients, imposed decarbonisation goals into our legal service contract, which no matter how good a lawyers we are, if we do not decarbonise in a 3-year period, we're off the contract. And that's revenue now is the cost of inaction. So to a degree, we have to be a bit more authoritarian with our own supply chain if we're able to make that. And so one of the things we did on top of the code of conduct was to implement in the autumn of last year sustainable procurement principles, whereby in effect we're setting out to say, well, we're being open, we're being transparent, we're being honest, but we're also being firm. Right now we encourage you to adopt as a minimum our targets, but we will oblige you in 3 years' time. And because that's the only way we're going to be able to meet with those decarbonisation goals. Now, this particular client was unique when they imposed them in 2022, but it's no longer unique. We have something of the region of 15% of global revenues tied into short-term decarbonisation goals. So we can't wait. So we have to strike that balance to bring people on the journey, but we also have to be a little bit more imposing in how fast you get on that journey, which is why we're quite keen to collaborate with other members on the supply chain in order to get more of the SMEs in particular to start now rather than wait till we have to oblige, because we've got a 15,000 suppliers tail. We've got 220 which cover our top 70%. That's a long tail, and ESG, sustainability, is going to be an easy tool to rationalise the supply chain. Don't want to, because we need to think of the communities we operate in, but ultimately if they're not going to work with us, we're going to walk away.
So would you say, and I think I've heard this from all three of you actually pretty much in these answers, that there's a shift away from the carrot approach to more of the stick approach? That's fair. Javier, I hope that translates. Instead of encouraging your suppliers to do good and be more sustainable, enforcing that. Which is exactly what Paddy was saying as well. This is happening, right? This is the situation you're in?
Yeah, I'd say it's probably a balance between the two. So kind of what Paddy said, I think we have our supply chain standards integrated into our legal agreements and so forth. But there is that kind of notion of listening to suppliers, because I think ultimately one thing that we're looking at is the innovation. So from our end, what opportunities are there with our suppliers to look at new innovative products or services that allows that? And actually, in order to create that innovation, you have to create that trust. And in order to create that trust, you have to have that very kind of carrots approach of like what's in it for them in that. And so I think from our end, what's really been successful is kind of bringing in not just the suppliers, but also our internal teams. So I think because the relationship is sat with the commercial teams, the buying teams, or the procurement teams, you two have to try and get them all involved in regards to kind of what the strategy looks like, why we're doing it, because most of the time if your suppliers are aligned, but then if they go back to the commercial teams and say this is important to you, then that's then the issue from that end. And so I think there is that balance between using a carrot and a stick, and I think sometimes, at least for us, we're having to kind of navigate through that for the most parts.
Okay, I just want to sum up really, so I'll ask each of you, I suppose. In terms of Scope 3, what's the biggest challenge that you still face right now? Paddy, I'll come to you first for this one. What's the biggest challenge you face, but also what's the biggest opportunity? And also, the timeline for that.
The biggest challenge Javier touched on as we were going through it there, we touched on already, we were a 15,000 supply chain, 15,000 slides in our supply chain, and spending the time to engage, to understand, to get on the journey, so we then get the data that we need to be able to report back is probably still our biggest challenge, and particularly when you trade it off against the commercials, the economic versus the emissions piece. The biggest opportunity, touch on it, it's for us, it's differentiation by getting ahead of what our clients are actually going to ask us at some point in the future, by already pointing out that we are already there. We are already reducing their scope 3 by reducing our scope 1, 2, scope 3. So that differentiation factor is probably big for us. Timeline, supply chain. We started, it's interesting, our maturity in terms of sustainability is not dissimilar to Mark's. We started our supply chain engagement in September of last year, hitting our top 220 to start with. We expect to finish that engagement and start enforcement in 36 months.
Javier?
I have two challenges. One will be meeting the SBTi target that we will validate for scope 3. And in order to do so, the biggest concern I have is having real data from the biggest chunk of the scope 3, which is my supply chain. Because we still work with the financial allocation. We're on the journey moving to product allocation or let's say, real data. We engage already with some key supplier to do kind of guinea pigs for them to work on their methodology for product allocation. But that real data fact is actually, I think, the biggest challenge, which we are working on it. I'm quite positive and optimistic on this because the level of the conversations, what we have, the programs and the involvement of the other internal stakeholders that are key to this, such as procurement, etc., it's totally a different scale now. So yeah, I would say that that is the biggest challenge by far.
And Mark?
So I think for us, I think we have two challenges right now that we have to overcome. So the first side for scope 3, and I think just from a data perspective, is not so much on data availability. So I think data is available because most companies have to meet those reporting requirements anyways. The challenges right now is actually where that data sits internally or externally and having those systems talk to one another. So I think the opportunity there is actually using technology, and I think we've heard a lot for today about technology and the use of AI. That's really going to have to be kind of that forefront of actually how your different systems, from your HR information to your procurement to your finance to supply chain, that's going to be one of the biggest challenges right now, is actually looking at how they're all connected into your overall reports. And then I think for us, the second challenge is supply fatigue. So we're acknowledging that a lot of our suppliers are probably getting inundated with lots of data requests, not just from us, and not only just from sustainability. So what we're trying to do and what the opportunities we're looking at is really listening to our suppliers of what kind of reporting timelines are they looking at. So if they're doing CDP reporting, which is normally around the June, July time, can we align a lot of the reporting by actually going beyond carbon? So can we streamline kind of that carbon data collection, but also go into circularity and look at plastic packaging tax information? Could we get the social responsibility and SEDEX information? So we're really trying to tie in kind of beyond scope 3 in that sense and kind of reduce that supply fatigue as much as possible. So those are probably the two challenges that we're trying to overcome right now.
And timeline?
Timeline, so I'd say for the data piece, it's probably going to be around kind of, I'd say 18 to 24 months, I think, in terms of not only connecting the data, but also just working through all of our suppliers. So we do have a target that 85% of our suppliers to have SBTi kind of aligned targets by 2027. So that means kind of in the next 24 months or so, or at least less than that. So by 25, we really need to get them all on board, because it normally takes about 18 months, 2 years to really go through that full process. And then I think, yeah, for the supply fatigue side, we've started that, but again, probably very similar, 18, 24 months.
Okay. Lots to talk about always with Scope 3, but that's all we've got time for today. Thank you so much, Mark, Javier, Paddy. Thank you.